April 25, 1918. He had no name, no medal, no grave the world could find. Only a photograph. 2 soldiers, one white, one dark-skinned, standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud of France. For decades, his story was lost beneath dust and silence. But behind that still image lies an act of defiance that saved hundreds of Australians. Before we continue, tell us, where are you watching from? Australia, the UK, the US, or somewhere far beyond the old battlefields of France? Type your country in the comments. Let's see how far this forgotten soldier's story still travels today. Tonight, his forgotten courage returns from the shadows. The story of the unidentified Aboriginal soldier who saved Australia's army. April 25, 1918. The Western Front lay silent for a heartbeat before the next storm. In a small French town called Villers-Bretonneux, the earth trembled beneath distant artillery. Among countless photographs captured by war correspondents, one image remains untouched by time. 2 soldiers standing side by side. Their faces reveal nothing of victory, only endurance. The man on the right, dark-skinned, calm and resolute, stares into the lens as if he already knew history would forget his name. The photograph carries a quiet defiance. It was taken in a brief lull between battles, when men still dared to smile through exhaustion. The white soldier's uniform bears the dust of the trenches, while his companion's sleeves are rolled, his expression unflinching. No caption names them, no record ties them to a regiment, yet their presence radiates something unmistakable. Brotherhood forged in terror. It is a portrait of unity captured in a world built on division. Somewhere beyond that camera's frame, France was burning. Australian troops had been thrown into desperate defense, holding a line that should have already collapsed. The Germans were advancing with tanks, a terrifying new weapon that turned soil to fire. In this chaos, these 2 men, strangers in origin, but equals in fate, stood together. What bound them was not politics or citizenship, it was survival, a pact born in blood and silence. The lens froze them in that moment, but the story beneath it kept breathing. The Aboriginal soldier's eyes seem older than his face. They carry the weight of 1,000 silences, centuries of displacement, of names taken and languages erased. Yet, within that single stare, there is defiance. He does not beg to be remembered. He challenges the world to notice. Around him, the European war machine grinds forward, consuming everything, but he stands unmoved, grounded like the red soil of the land he came from, half a world away. Historians later argued whether he was even supposed to be there. The policies of the time forbade Aboriginal men from serving overseas, but the front cared little for laws. Bullets did not discriminate. Somewhere, a recruiting officer had looked the other way, or perhaps he had lied about his heritage, shaving years and reshaping his identity just to wear the uniform. Whatever the path, he had crossed the impossible. His presence on that battlefield was rebellion made flesh. And so the photograph remains. 2 men framed by ruin waiting for the next command. One known, one lost. Together they represent more than soldiers. They embody a truth that history itself tried to bury. The silence between them is not absence, but meaning. It whispers of a nation still learning who its heroes truly were. In that frozen instant, beneath the dust and grain of the old film, the unidentified soldier's story begins. Not with glory, but with the stillness before it. The Great War had dragged on for 4 relentless years, devouring entire generations. The Western Front was no longer a battlefield, but a graveyard that stretched beyond the horizon. Each sunrise revealed a landscape shredded by artillery, the air thick with smoke and decay. For Australia, a young nation barely federated for 2 decades, this was its brutal introduction to global war. From Gallipoli to the Somme, its soldiers had carved a reputation for courage and sacrifice, but courage alone was no longer enough. By early 1918, the German army had launched a massive offensive, pushing the Allies to the brink of collapse. Villers-Bretonneux was the final shield protecting the vital rail lines to Amiens. If it fell, the road to Paris would lie open. The Australians were ordered to hold at all costs. They were exhausted, undersupplied and outnumbered. But retreat was not an option. In the chill dawn, men whispered quiet prayers, knowing many would not live to see another day. Among them stood men who should never have been there. Aboriginal Australians, stripped of rights in their own land, had enlisted in secret or under false names. They were labourers, trackers and stockmen, men of the soil, now thrust into the mud of Europe to defend an empire that denied their humanity. Some fought for pay, others for pride, but most fought for something deeper, the simple right to stand as equals under fire. They bled beside men who would not drink beside them back home. To the commanders they were statistics, bodies in uniform, faces without stories. Yet in the trenches, under the roar of artillery, there were no ranks of race. There was only survival. One veteran later recalled, "He didn't talk much, that dark fellow, but when shells came down, he didn't move an inch. He just kept firing." Such moments went unrecorded, swallowed by the war's vast indifference, but they were the quiet pillars of victory. The mud at Villers-Bretonneux was more than soil. It was the world's conscience, thick and unforgiving. Each shell crater was a reminder that empire demanded blood from those it refused to see. Still, the Aboriginal soldiers endured. They cleaned their rifles, patched their boots, and marched under a flag that had never recognized them. Every step toward the front was both duty and defiance. Every bullet fired a claim to belonging in a nation that had cast them aside. When the guns finally thundered that morning, the sky turned red with dust and smoke. Orders rang through the trenches, sharp and desperate. The Australians braced for impact, hearts pounding like drums, and somewhere in that chaos, amid thousands of nameless uniforms, the unidentified soldier from the photograph took his position. He was not fighting for a medal or a place in history. He was fighting simply to hold the line, because if he fell, so would everything behind him. Long before he stood in the mud of Villers-Bretonneux, the unidentified soldier belonged to a world far removed from Europe's chaos. He came from the sunburnt interior of Australia, a place where red soil clung to bare feet and the horizon stretched without end. In that land, men like him were not citizens. They were subjects without rights, counted in censuses but absent from the nation's soul. Yet, when the bugle of war sounded across the oceans, he answered without hesitation. Recruitment posters covered every town wall. "Fight for the Empire," they declared, adorned with Union Jacks and proud slogans. But when Aboriginal men stepped forward, many were turned away. The regulations were explicit. Only those of substantial European descent could enlist. Still, he persisted. Perhaps he lied about his lineage, claiming to be Maori or Pacific Islander. Perhaps a sympathetic officer looked past his skin. What matters is that he crossed a forbidden line to fight for a flag that had never fought for him. The journey to enlistment was itself a quiet rebellion. He left behind his community, family, tribe, land, without fanfare. There were no farewells at the train station, no photographs kissed before departure. He walked into anonymity with steady purpose. On the train to Brisbane or Sydney, other recruits joked and smoked, unaware of the story seated beside them. When they spoke of loyalty and freedom, he remained silent, knowing those words had never belonged to him. But war would make them his, one way or another. At the training camps, the silence followed him. Officers barked orders, boots pounded in unison, and the air reeked of sweat and discipline. He obeyed every command, mastered every drill. Some noticed his precision, others his quiet endurance. One corporal muttered, "That fella doesn't speak much, but he moves like he's done this before." What none of them understood was that he had trained all his life, in resilience, in invisibility, in the art of surviving among those who refused to see him. When the time came to embark, he stood among hundreds on the Fremantle docks. Mothers wept, bands played, and flags fluttered in the salt wind. No one waved to him. No letter followed his name. Yet, as the ship's horn bellowed across the harbour, he stared at the disappearing coast with something between sorrow and resolve. The continent that had denied him now lay behind. Ahead awaited a war that would not care who he was. For the first time, he belonged, if only to danger. Days at sea turned into weeks, the waves endless and hypnotic. The men joked about French girls, about medals and glory. He cleaned his rifle in silence, memorizing its weight, its purpose. One night, a fellow private asked where he was from. He answered simply, "The center of nowhere." It was both truth and defiance. When the transport ship finally reached the cold shores of Europe, he stepped off not as an outcast, but as a soldier of the Empire. Unwanted, unseen, yet undeniably present. His war and his reckoning had just begun. The first winter in France struck like a living thing. Men who had grown up beneath Australian sun now woke beneath blankets of frost. The unidentified soldier learned quickly how to keep his rifle dry, how to sleep through the thunder of guns, how to eat with shaking hands. The smell of wet wool and cordite followed them everywhere. Each night, distant flashes turned the sky white. The front was not a place. It was a state of endurance, a rhythm of noise, fear and waiting. He shared a trench with men from Sydney, Perth and Melbourne. Some spoke of farms and sweethearts. Others cursed the rain. He rarely joined their talk, but his silence carried a weight the others respected. Once, during a lull, a young private asked if he missed home. He answered quietly, "Home doesn't miss me." No one spoke again for the rest of the night. They understood in their own way that his war had begun long before Europe called. The routine was relentless. Before dawn, they repaired sandbags and cleaned rifles. After dusk, they carried ammunition through blackened fields. Shells screamed overhead like iron birds. Rats grew fat on spilled rations and corpses. He grew thinner, sharper, his face hard as flint, his eyes unblinking. When shells landed too close, he did not flinch. When orders changed, he adapted. His steadiness began to draw notice. Officers watched him with grudging respect. In chaos, calm men became the spine of the line. On rare, quiet days, he would carve small marks into the wooden stock of his rifle, not for kills, not for pride, just to count the days he had survived. There were no letters to write, no names to call. The others received parcels from home, photographs wrapped in paper. He received nothing but the cold, yet he never complained. A sergeant once asked, half in jest, what kept him steady. He replied, "If I fall, no one will remember me, so I won't." The march toward Villers-Bretonneux began under a blood-red sky. Rumors spread that the Germans had broken through, that tanks were crushing the Allied lines. The battalion moved in silence, boots sinking into mud that smelled of death. Every step was a reminder of how small one man was against the machinery of war. But the Aboriginal soldier walked with purpose. His breath fogged the air like smoke, and his shadow stretched long behind him, as though the land itself still followed him across the sea. When they reached the outskirts of the town, the fields were already burning. The sound of engines rolled through the mist, German armor advancing fast. Orders came in fragments. Hold the line, no retreat. The men took their positions, faces pale under the moonlight. He checked his weapon, adjusted his pack and glanced once at the photograph taken weeks before, the last calm moment before the storm. As the first shells struck, he exhaled slowly, his pulse steady. Whatever happened next, he would not turn away. His place in history was waiting in the fire ahead. The night before the assault, the sky trembled with artillery. Each blast rippled through the ground, shaking the trench walls like the heartbeat of something monstrous beneath the earth. Rain turned to mist, clinging to helmets and rifles. The men waited in silence, breaths shallow, eyes fixed on the horizon. The Aboriginal soldier sat with his back against the sandbags, hands clasped around his weapon. He didn't pray. He only whispered once to himself, "Let me stand where others fall." Then the order came, "Prepare to advance." At dawn, the German tanks appeared through the fog like black phantoms, their treads grinding the soil into blood. Machine guns erupted, tearing through the first line of defense. Officers shouted commands lost to the thunder of shells. The Australians fired blindly, smoke swallowing the world around them. The Aboriginal soldier moved with precision, loading, firing, shifting position. His calm was unnatural, almost inhuman. When others ducked, he aimed. When they fled, he stayed. The field turned into a storm of iron, and he stood in its eye. When the flank began to collapse, panic swept the trench. Men scrambled for cover, their nerves fraying under the barrage. The commanding sergeant fell, throat struck by shrapnel. For a moment, leadership died with him. Then the dark-skinned soldier took command without a word. He grabbed the fallen man's machine gun, repositioned it, and shouted, "Hold your ground." His voice cut through the chaos like steel. Others rallied around him, finding courage in the steadiness of his defiance. Every bullet he fired seemed to carve a space between death and survival. Hours stretched like years. The Germans advanced in waves, each one fiercer than the last. The Aboriginal soldier's uniform was torn, his hands blistered and blackened by the barrel's heat. A nearby private screamed for ammunition. He tossed him his last belt without hesitation. When the gun finally jammed, he drew his sidearm and kept firing until it too clicked empty. Still, he did not retreat. He fought not as a man defending a line, but as one defending the right to exist. The mud beneath him became both battlefield and altar. By midday, the sound of engines faded. Reinforcements had arrived. The Germans, bleeding and broken, began to withdraw. The town of Villers-Bretonneux still stood barely. Smoke coiled over the ruins, carrying the stench of burnt oil and death. The Aboriginal soldier sank to his knees, exhausted, his hands trembling for the first time. Around him lay silence, punctuated only by the cries of the wounded. He looked down at his uniform, shredded and soaked in mud, and muttered, "We held." It was not pride, it was disbelief. When the roll was called that evening, his name was missing. Some said he was seen last beside the machine gun, still firing as the sky burned red. Others swore they found him unconscious, carried off with the wounded. No record survived. Only the aftermath remained, a victory credited to no single man. Yet those who had fought beside him remembered. A private later recalled, "There was one fella who wouldn't fall. He saved the lot of us." His name? Don't think he had one. And so, in silence, the legend began. When the guns finally fell silent, Villers-Bretonneux was a graveyard of mud and smoke. The ground, once green, was now blackened and soaked with blood. Bodies lay tangled in barbed wire, their faces unrecognizable, their uniforms indistinguishable beneath the filth. Crows circled low, unbothered by the scent of death. The Aboriginal soldier's name did not appear in any report. Some said he was taken by stretcher-bearers. Others insisted he vanished into the fog. In truth, history recorded the victory, but not the man who made it possible. The wounded were gathered in makeshift hospitals, their groans blending with the hum of generators and the clatter of stretchers. Doctors moved from cot to cot, sewing torn flesh, ignoring rank or race. Somewhere among them, perhaps, lay the man from the photograph, silent, nameless, still breathing. A nurse might have asked his name, and maybe he whispered it once before passing into sleep. But the papers that survived the chaos listed him simply as unknown private, a number without a story. Back home in Australia, newspapers hailed the triumph at Villers-Bretonneux. Headlines called it Australia's finest hour. Names of officers and decorated men filled the columns. Photographs of medals, telegrams, and parades covered the front pages. But in the stations and farms across the country, families still waited for sons who would never return. In one distant community, an empty chair remained by the fire. Its owner never mentioned aloud. For the nation, the war was pride. For those forgotten, it was silence. In the archives of the Imperial War Office, files grew thicker while lives grew smaller. The bureaucracy of victory erased the edges of humanity. The Aboriginal soldier's file, if it ever existed, might have been discarded, his heritage inconvenient, his presence unofficial. And yet, even in absence, he lingered. His photograph traveled from hand to hand, across time, outlasting the very war that consumed him. In that image, his defiance remained unburned by history's indifference. Among returning soldiers, his name became rumor. They spoke of a quiet man who held the gun when others fell. One corporal told the story in pubs for years. "There was this bloke dark as night who saved us when we had nothing left. Never saw him again." Some listeners dismissed it as myth, others felt the truth beneath it. Every army breeds legends, but not all legends are born of fiction. Some are born because justice refused to speak. The cost of that silence would echo for generations. When the medals were distributed, his chest remained bare. When the parades marched, his footsteps went unheard. Yet in the soil of Villers-Bretonneux, something endured. His stand, his courage, his quiet rebellion against a world that denied his name. He had fought not only an enemy across the field, but an empire that measured worth by color. And though his story was buried, the earth remembered. Beneath the mud and crosses, his defiance became eternal. When the surviving battalions finally returned home, the noise of Europe faded into the rustle of eucalyptus and cicadas. Parades filled the cities, flags draped from verandas, and cheers echoed through the streets. Australia was celebrating its heroes, proud of its young nation's sacrifice. Yet for some, there were no parades, only the quiet hum of wind across forgotten plains. Among those who had fought and bled, Aboriginal soldiers slipped back into invisibility. Their uniforms were surrendered, their service dismissed like a dream that history refused to acknowledge. The unidentified soldier's name never reached the records of the Returned Services League. There were no medals sent to his family, no letter from the Crown, no official recognition that he had ever existed. If he returned, he came home to the same fences that once told him where he could and could not walk. Some veterans recalled seeing a dark-skinned man standing alone at the railway station, hat in hand, watching the crowds embrace each other. No one knew his name, and no one asked. For Aboriginal communities, the war's end brought neither freedom nor equality. The same laws that had excluded them before still ruled their lives. The government thanked its soldiers, but not its outcasts. Many who had served found themselves denied pensions and housing, refused entry into the pubs where their white comrades drank to victory. One veteran told a journalist he could fight for the empire, but he couldn't buy a beer in his own town. The cruelty of peace cut deeper than the wounds of war. Time did what empires could not. It erased. The trenches filled with grass, the towns rebuilt, and the faces of the fallen faded into sepia ghosts. Yet, in the deep silence of forgotten archives, the photograph endured. Its image traveled between historians, collectors, and families, searching for traces of memory. The man on the right, his eyes steady, his shoulders squared, seemed to defy the very act of forgetting. Even as his name vanished, his gaze held the world accountable. Generations later, scholars began to uncover fragments of his possible identity, service numbers with no origin, enlistment cards missing birthplaces, scattered accounts of Aboriginal soldiers who fought at Villers-Bretonneux. Each clue led to another dead end, as if history itself guarded his secret. Perhaps his anonymity was not an accident, but an inheritance, proof that some sacrifices are too pure to fit inside the boundaries of empire. The truth had survived only in whispers and faces, passed through generations like sacred fire. And so the photograph remained, haunting and unbroken. To most it was merely a relic of war. To others, it was a mirror reflecting everything the nation had tried to forget. His story was more than a footnote. It was a question still unanswered. Who decides which heroes are remembered and which are erased? Beneath the layers of silence and time, his presence refused to fade. The man without a name had become something greater, a shadow that history could no longer ignore. Decades passed, and the world moved forward, dragging its wars into textbooks and its soldiers into parades of fading memory. Yet somewhere, in a small French attic, the photograph survived, its edges yellowed, its faces still alive beneath the dust. It resurfaced in the hands of a historian who studied the portraits of Australian troops taken by Louis and Antoinette Tuillier in Villers-Bretonneux. Among thousands of captured faces, this one stood apart. Two men, side by side, one known, one forgotten, one remembered by name, the other remembered by the truth of his defiance. The discovery reignited questions long buried under national pride. Who was the Aboriginal soldier who had fought for a land that would not claim him? Researchers scoured enlistment rolls, diaries, and family archives. In each story they uncovered, a pattern emerged. Men of indigenous descent who lied about their heritage just to serve. Some wrote farmer, others laborer, concealing bloodlines that empire deemed unworthy. The photograph became a symbol, not just of one man, but of every silenced life that defied erasure through the simple act of standing to fight. Across Australia, historians, veterans' descendants, and Aboriginal elders began to speak his name, though none could say what it was. They saw in him their fathers, their grandfathers, men who returned from war to find no home, no rights, no place in the story their courage had shaped. One elder told a journalist, "They sent us to die for a king who never knew our names. But this man, this one," he looked back. "That's why we remember him." In that photograph, remembrance became rebellion. Museums displayed his image, accompanied by plaques filled with speculation and reverence. Visitors stopped before it, drawn by the intensity of his stare. Veterans recognized the posture of discipline and fatigue. Others saw something older, something sacred, the dignity of a warrior whose land had never been conquered in spirit. Children asked who he was, and curators answered, "We don't know." Yet each repetition of that ignorance became its own form of truth, that the nameless too can be immortal. Over time, his photograph became a kind of mirror for the nation. In it, Australians saw both pride and shame, the glory of sacrifice and the failure to honor it equally. Documentaries were made, books written, lectures delivered, but none could fill the silence behind his gaze. Every retelling revealed not certainty, but humility. His face seemed to whisper that history belongs not to those who are recorded, but to those who endure. He had become not a man, but an echo that refused to fade. And so, more than a century later, his story is no longer about what was lost, but about what was reclaimed. The unidentified Aboriginal soldier, once a shadow among millions, now stands as a testament to the forgotten strength that built a nation's freedom. His photograph, once anonymous, now speaks louder than any medal. It tells us that courage needs no witness, that truth outlives its deniers. In his silence, we hear the sound of a country learning to remember. Even now, more than a century later, the air of Villers-Bretonneux carries whispers of that April morning. Beneath the carefully tended grass of the war cemeteries, the soil remembers every heartbeat that once trembled there. Tourists walk the paths with cameras, unaware that one of those buried without a name may have been the man who saved them all. The Aboriginal soldier's face, once trapped in a photograph, now drifts through history like smoke, unclaimed but indestructible. His silence has become the language of endurance itself. In Australia, remembrance ceremonies echo every April 25th. Flags rise, trumpets sound, and voices recite the solemn words, "They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old." Among the faces projected on screens and monuments, his image sometimes appears. No caption, no rank, no unit. Just that same steady gaze, untouched by time. People pause when they see it, drawn not by recognition, but by something deeper. They feel the weight of the story that history nearly buried, and the debt that cannot be repaid. For the descendants of those who fought beside him, the story is not myth, it is inheritance. They tell their children about the nameless man who refused to fall. They teach them that courage is not given by governments or medals, but born in defiance. One veteran's grandson once said, "He fought for a country that didn't see him, and that's why we must never look away." His words spread online, igniting a quiet movement. Remembrance not for fame, but for truth. Through memory, the soldier finally reclaimed his place among the living. In galleries and classrooms, his story is now taught as both pride and warning. Teachers speak of valor and injustice in the same breath. Students listen to the lesson of two Australias, one that fought abroad and one that still fights at home for recognition. The unidentified soldier bridges those worlds. His story reminds them that history's silence is never empty. It is waiting for someone brave enough to break it. His photograph has become both wound and healing, a symbol of unfinished justice. As evening falls on Villers-Bretonneux, the last light bends across the graves, turning the white stones to gold. The wind moves softly through the crosses, carrying the scent of grass and iron. Somewhere beneath that light lies a man who had no nation, but still saved one. The world may never know his name, but it knows his truth, that courage can outlive prejudice and honor can bloom even in the soil of denial. His victory was not of war, but of dignity, and so his story ends where it began, in silence, framed by the faces of the forgotten. Yet this silence is no longer the emptiness of neglect, but the peace of remembrance. The photograph still rests in archives and hearts alike, its edges worn, its meaning unbroken. He had no name, no medal, no grave the world could find, but now he has what history once denied him, memory. And as long as his image endures, Australia will never again forget the man who saved its army.